It was the year 2015 in Wisconsin. A group of young people who worked at a business together took some time off to go camping. Their names were Mike, Jill, Alex, Alan, David, and Elizabeth. Mike and Jill were married, and the rest of the group was as well, but Mike and Jill were the only coworkers that were married together, while the other spouses just decided to stay at home. Mike was the one who planned the trip, so he organized the schedule for the time the group would go, etc. They were excited to do something like this, so they had fun and laughed together while continuing to drive down the forest road on the way to the campsite. The camp they were going to was called Camp Devon, a local campsite that Mike found on an advertisement poster pinned to a utility pole near his house. It was odd that Mike never heard of this place until seeing that poster, which made him and the others assume that it was probably just a new campsite built recently. The group eventually arrived at Camp Devon and saw a little sign near the entrance which had the name of the site on it. The group parked the camper at a little open spot and went outside to be greeted by fresh air. It was unusual not to be checked in by a park ranger, and they noticed how they were the only ones there. Plus, the camp seemed very small. The group eventually got organized after about a half an hour of working, such as unloading supplies for camping, etc. David was going to cook steak, but he somehow forgot it, so he had the idea of going to a supermarket that was about 15 minutes away from the camp. David made a vote on going to the supermarket, so the rest of the group nodded their heads in agreement. Everyone nodded except for Alan, who just remained silent. The rest of the group questioned why Alan chose to stay and said that he had a headache and didn't feel well, so they understood his reasoning for it. Mike, Jill, Alex, David, and Elizabeth went to the store in Mike's car while Alan stayed back at the site since he wasn't feeling well and just decided to sit on the couch in the camper. Meanwhile, the group made it to the supermarket and walked inside. They went into the meat aisle to find the steak and other kinds of food that they might need for the rest of the trip, so they continued shopping. Meanwhile, back at the campsite, Alan was watching TV. As he was watching TV, however, he suddenly heard a knock at the window. It was loud enough for him to hear because the TV volume was low. He paused the TV and looked over to the window, curious as to what it was. He didn't think much of it until he heard another knock. The knocking continued consistently, getting a little louder. Alan was very unsettled now and didn't know what to do. He stared at the window in fear as he saw nothing but darkness outside. Whoever or whatever was out there was watching Alan because the blinds were open, covering nothing inside the camper. Alan quickly stood up and went to close the blinds to the window. The knocking then suddenly went from the window to the door of the camper. Alan slowly turned his head towards the door and was now frightened. Whoever was outside eventually started hitting on the door aggressively. Alan was panicking so much that he went over to the knife stand and grabbed a kitchen knife to make himself feel safer. He slowly walked over to the door, holding the knife, ready to attack if whoever was out there tried to break into the camper. The knocking eventually stopped, so Alan closed his eyes and sighed in relief. He continued to hold the knife just to feel safe from whoever or whatever was out there. He didn't know if he should tell the rest of the group what happened, in fear of them not believing him and thinking that he was crazy, even though deep down he wasn't. The group eventually made it back to the campsite and they ate dinner together. Alan disclosed what happened while they were gone because he didn't want to bring fear to the rest of the group. The next day, the group went outside to eat breakfast together and noticed that Alan seemed off, since he wasn't doing good hiding last night to himself. Alan told them that something had occurred the night before, but didn't say what it was yet. After the group asked for clarification again, Alan finally told them that he heard someone knocking on the camper door the night before, indicating that somebody was there at the campsite. Some members of the group were freaked out by this because their minds went to the worst possible scenario. Alex didn't believe it, despite being unsettled by it, because he didn't want it to be true. The group got into an argument over this, since some of them had different observations on the situation, leading to both confusion and fear. David concluded that it was a homeless man looking for a place to stay, but Alan knew that this wasn't true, and it offended him. As the group was arguing, however, Mike made a shocking yet terrifying discovery on the side of the camper. Mike tried to alert the rest of the group, but the arguing was too loud. Mike shouted again, louder this time, so the rest of the group looked over at Mike in curiosity. Mike told them that they were going to want to see what he found, so the rest of the group walked over to where he was standing, and they were downright disturbed by what they saw on the camper. There was a bloody handprint smeared on the side of the camper, which meant that it was possibly the same person knocking from the night before. The group was terrified by this sight and realized that the situation they were in was worse than they thought. The others now realized that Alan was telling the truth, and they had to figure out who was stalking them, especially after seeing the bloody handprint. They decided that they should call the police, since there were so many red flags that they were dealing with while staying at Camp Devon. Alan and Alex wanted to leave, but Mike assured them that things would be okay when they get help from the police. When Mike dialed 911, however, it said no service on his phone, which ticked him off. Mike notified the rest of the group that he'd have to drive out to the supermarket to get cell service. He left the camp to go get cell service, while the rest of the group stayed back. He got to the supermarket, dialed 911, and explained what was happening, such as the knocking on the camper at night and the bloody handprints smeared on the side of the camper the next day. The 911 operator said that she would send an officer on the way to Camp Devon, and so she did. Mike went back to the campsite, hoping that things would work according to the plan. Meanwhile, the group was waiting inside the camper for Mike or the police to arrive. Mike eventually arrived back at the campsite, and the group walked out of the camper to see him. Mike told the rest of the group that the sheriff would be there soon to help. As they waited, they saw the sheriff patrol car pull up to their site, and the officer parked his car, so they went over to talk with the cop. They greeted each other, and Mike explained to him what was going on. The group led the sheriff over to the area where the bloody handprint was, only to make another shocking discovery. The bloody handprint was somehow gone, even though it was there not long ago. The group got sick to their stomachs seeing this, and they didn't know how this was remotely possible. Mike was asking himself where the bloody handprint went, to which the sheriff was confused by this. Mike then asked the rest of the group if they removed the evidence somehow, to which they responded that they'd never do something like that. The sheriff got annoyed and questioned them for calling him out there, even though there was no actual evidence. The group tried their best to persuade the sheriff that there was evidence, along with staying to help them, but he thought they were lying, so he decided to leave. Alex called the sheriff a useless idiot just for leaving the group and refusing to help them. Mike recommended staying another night to see what would happen, but Alan refused to. Mike eventually persuaded to make the group stay, despite them all being uncomfortable with this idea. Alex wouldn't stop complaining about having to stay another night, along with thinking Mike would get them killed, so David had to put him in his place by making him shut up about it. Suddenly, however, the group heard someone walking in the woods nearby because the leaves were crunching. The group were easily alarmed by this and looked in the direction the sound was coming from, but saw nothing since there were too many trees blocking their view from the source of the sound. David then wondered if this was the same person who did the knocking on the camper the night before, watching Alan. Mike shouted at whoever was in the woods to come out if they were the person harassing them. Suddenly, the person came into sight, and it turned out to be a man, but he was in horrible condition. His face was bruised, and he had a bunch of scars. He also had bloodstains on his clothing, which was the most disturbing part about this man. The group was shocked and unsettled by this man's appearance, and they did not feel good about this. Mike demanded for the man to tell him his name, but he didn't answer. Mike demanded yet again, and the man mentioned that his name was Nick. David asked why the man was lurking near their campsite, to which he said that there was no reason other than the fact that he just found their site unintentionally. They didn't believe him and accused the man of being the person knocking on the camper the night before. Nick, however, claimed that he wasn't the one doing the knocking, but he knew of the one that did it, and mentioned that he had explained to the group why they were unsafe there. The group looked at each other with serious facial expressions, and so they decided to let Nick join them at their campsite, for now. The group, along with Nick, went inside the camper to sit down and have a conversation. Elizabeth offered bandages for Nick's scars, but he said most of them were a week old, so he didn't need any. Mike asked how Nick knew of this person who came knocking on the camper window and door. Then Nick mentioned that he's dealt with the same kind of people because they are a part of a large group. The group got very curious after Nick mentioned this. Jill then asked who this group was, and Nick mentioned that they don't have a specific name, but he likes to call them the Forest Stalkers. Nick explained that they use tactics of fear and manipulation before killing their victims. Alan asked if they would have killed him if he opened the door the night of the knocking, to which Nick said that they would have. Mike asked what they look like, and Nick said that barely anybody knows what they look like since they hide in the shadows. However, Nick begins to tell the story of how he saw one of them and wished he never did. Nick was on the run from the Forest Stalkers, and he got tired of running, so he fell to the ground. He then heard footsteps from behind him, so he shined his flashlight on whoever or whatever it was. Then told the group that what he saw is something that no human should ever have to see. What he saw was a deformed-looking person, over 6 feet tall. It had red eyes with black human-like pupils, and its arms were long and skinny. Both of its legs were unidentical to the other, and its one leg looked like a deer leg since it had a hoof. Its face had a wide smile, but its mouth wouldn't twitch as if it was stuck like that in a fixated position. The group was downright unsettled by what Nick just told them, and it evoked more fear in them than ever. Mike asked how many there could be, and Nick mentioned that they could have numbers of 60 or more for all he knew. Mike then asked if Nick wanted to stay the night with them, since he's been through a lot, and so Nick said sure. Mike asked the rest of the group if they were okay with this, and everyone nodded in agreement except for Alex. Alex wanted to speak with Mike in private, so they both went outside. Alex tried to convince Mike that letting a random stranger spend the night with them was a horrible idea. He even went as far as to say Nick was one of the Forest Stalkers, or even a spy for them. Mike eventually calmed Alex down and reassured him that Nick wasn't a bad person and things would be okay just like they planned for them to be. Later that night, the group got ready for what events might occur with the Forest Stalkers, and they had preparations for it. Jill felt worried spending another night, knowing that someone or something was watching them in the woods. Mike then reasoned with her, saying that if the police can't solve this situation, then only they could. The group looked at each other and they nodded in agreement with what Mike said. Mike's main strategy was to make whoever was out there afraid of them, to boost their confidence. Elizabeth asked Mike how that was going to work, to which Mike said that the Forest Stalkers needed to know that they weren't playing around, and that's when Mike grabbed a pump-action shotgun, cocking it back after he said this. The group settled in and was staying alert for someone or something to come near the camper. Elizabeth asked if some of them could go to sleep if they got tired, and Mike said yes, but one person had to stay awake on watch. Alan offered to take watch after Mike, but Mike mentioned how he wasn't going to sleep, so Alan didn't need to. Elizabeth wanted to close the blinds in fear of being watched, but Mike wanted them open so that whoever was out there would know they were armed and ready to fight back to scare them off. The group nodded and continued with the night. Mike sat on the couch, staring at the window for most of the night, while some of the others slept. Mike eventually started to become drowsy and had a hard time keeping his eyes open, so he decided to give the gun to Alex so he could stay on watch, despite thinking Mike wouldn't need to sleep, but he just got ahead of himself. Luckily, there was no knocking throughout the night, which was a sign of relief. The next day, the group had breakfast together again and talked about what happened last night. Mike mentioned there was no knocking, indicating that they probably scared the Forest Stalkers away. The rest of the group agreed that they should spend their last day at camp doing something fun to clear their mind off what happened earlier and just forget about it. Alex, Alan, and Elizabeth decided to go on a hike at the nearby trail together, while the rest of the group stayed back at camp. They were going to bring walkie-talkies with them in case of an emergency. Mike informed them that they were planning to leave by 6 p.m. and needed to be back no later than 5:30 p.m. The group then realized that they hadn't seen Nick for a while, because David explained how he and Nick got up before the rest of the group, then Nick went for a walk, but he hasn't returned since. It was at least 4 hours since he was gone, which was a serious red flag. Mike, David, and Jill decided to go look for Nick in the woods near the campsite before it got too late. Meanwhile, Alex, Alan, and Elizabeth were still hiking on the trail, enjoying their time together. They soon realized that it was starting to get late because the sun was setting. They were planning to head back to camp, but Alex forgot his wallet on a stump they found earlier. Alan questioned Alex for his stupidity on leaving his wallet on a stump, and Alex said he put it down to swap its place for something in his backpack, but for some reason forgot to grab it. Alan told Alex to be quick, since the walk to the stump was far. Alan offered to wait by the trail marker they were at, but Elizabeth wanted to just go back to the campsite. Elizabeth started heading back to the campsite, while Alex went to get his wallet, and Alan waited near the trail marker. Meanwhile, Mike, David, and Jill were still looking for Nick in the woods near the campsite. They called out for Nick, shouting his name in the woods, but got no answer. The group kept walking until suddenly, a dead body hanging from a noose swung in front of them. Jill screamed, and Mike and David got freaked out. As the group took a closer look, however, they realized that this was no ordinary dead body. It was the dead body of Nick. Jill told them that they had to leave now, and Mike mentioned that he for sure knew these were the forest stalkers who did this. Mike, David, and Jill went back to the campsite in fear of what would happen next. Meanwhile, Alex was still walking on the trail to get his wallet, and he eventually found the stump he left it at. However, he noticed that his wallet wasn't on the stump anymore. He specifically remembered his wallet being on the stump, and if it wasn't there anymore, that means someone took it. Alex had no choice but to walk back without his wallet, because it was starting to get dark outside. Alex made it back to the mile marker that Alan stayed at, only to see that Alan was missing too. Something was very wrong if Alex's wallet wasn't on the stump anymore when he checked it out, and Alan just mysteriously left the trail marker despite saying he'd stay there. Alex called out for Alan, but got no answer, so he started to wander around the woods, calling his name out more, hoping to get an answer if he was nearby. However, as Alex was in the woods, he noticed an abandoned cabin in the distance. For some odd reason, Alex had this strange thought that Alan was in there, and so he decided to go over to the cabin. As Alex got closer, however, he started to notice how badly in shape the cabin was. The front windows were broken, and glass was on the ground. When he got inside, however, it was even worse. There was a ton of garbage on the floor, and a bunch of objects were broken and smashed. It looked like someone had broken in there and destroyed the place. There was also a strange smell, like something was rotting in there. Alex noticed a hallway to the left of him and decided to walk over to it. It was very dark in the cabin, so Alex turned on his phone flashlight. Alex called out for Alan again, but still to no avail. The vibe of the cabin was very eerie. He noticed more stuff was trashed on the floor in the hallway, and he found a random door. Alex tried to open the door, but it was locked, which was very strange considering the place was abandoned. As Alex was standing near the door, however, he heard footsteps from the other end of the hallway. Alex called Alan's name again, but they didn't answer. He started to walk over to the other end where he came from and started to get annoyed, demanding Alan to answer him, but still got no response. However, as Alex made it to the other side of the hallway, he noticed something disturbing on the wall that wasn't there before. There were words that said, "Alan's not here," written in blood. Alex was genuinely freaked out now and pulled out his walkie-talkie to try and contact the rest of the group. However, as he was standing near the wall, he couldn't help but see movement in his peripheral vision to the left of him. Alex slowly turned his head and noticed a dark figure standing about 15 feet away from him, peeking their head from behind a wall with their arms wrapped around it. Alex almost had a heart attack from fear and dropped the walkie-talkie. He bolted out of the cabin faster than he's ever run before and hid behind a tree outside. Alex turned his head to look over at the cabin, and luckily he saw nobody coming out and thought that it was a good idea to start running, so he did. Alex had this fear that the person he saw in the house was one of the forest stalkers, which was the most logical theory considering the terrifying events that they'd been dealing with. Meanwhile, back at the camp, Mike, David, and Jill were trying to figure out what to do about the situation. Mike told them that they needed to start packing, but David wanted to stay and find the others who haven't returned from the hike. Mike didn't know if those who went on the hike were still alive or not, which is why he wanted to get out of there as fast as they could, since there was only a chance of them returning. Mike turned around and looked at David and Jill with a serious facial expression. He then asked David if he would drive to the convenience store with service and call the police. They might have called the police the day before, but that cop was useless, and it led to a misunderstanding about the handprint being removed by the forest stalkers, because that was the most obvious thing which did it. Plus, the group was in more danger than ever at this point, so they had actual evidence this time to prove what was happening to them. After Mike asked David, however, David remembered that he had a friend named John, who was a cop, and for some reason, it didn't cross his mind to think about this before until now. David left the campsite to go call the police, while Mike and Jill stayed at the campsite inside of the camper. Mike and Jill kept packing until they were eventually finished. They waited patiently, Mike holding the shotgun he had from earlier in case they'd get attacked by the forest stalkers. Mike blamed himself for everything that's happened, since he planned this trip and made the rest of the group stay a second night despite it not being safe. As they were sitting down, however, they noticed the walkie-talkie giving off feedback with static sounds. Mike went over to the walkie-talkie and picked it up to listen. What they heard next was not the voice of Alex, but something much more eerie. The walkie-talkie had more feedback, and whoever was on the other end spoke, but it didn't sound like they were saying words. It was just gibberish in some creepy dialect. Mike and Jill looked at each other, horrified by what they were hearing. After Alex dropped the walkie-talkie on the floor in that cabin, the mysterious person he saw must have grabbed it and used it for themselves to scare the others. Meanwhile, Alex ran off into the woods, and he kept looking behind to make sure he wasn't being followed by whatever or whoever he saw in that cabin. He then ran over a bear trap, which stopped him. He screamed in pain as his leg was stuck in the bear trap. Alex tried to escape the bear trap, but it was locked. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him because he was deep in the woods and it was starting to get dark outside. Alex kept trying to unlock the bear trap, and somehow, by some miracle, he eventually did and got free, but his leg was injured, so he had to limp along the way. Meanwhile, David made it to the convenience store and parked his car in the parking lot. David called his friend who was a cop, and he eventually answered. John said hello, and David continued to explain what was going on. David didn't have a better way to explain what was happening, aside from a group of insane people/things watching them in the woods on a camping trip and attempted to murder them. John believed David, and then David mentioned that they were staying at a place called Camp Devon, so John searched for it on the coordinates. David waited for a few seconds as John was searching for it. However, what John told David next was something that would change the course of events and send shivers down his spine. According to the online map coordinates, there was no such place as Camp Devon because it didn't exist. David didn't believe John, but John proved that the coordinates weren't lying. Camp Devon is not real. David sat there speechlessly, not knowing how to face the truth of this harsh reality. John then told David that wherever Mike took him and the rest of the group isn't safe, and whoever put the sign up that advertised Camp Devon was not someone to be messed with. David then had flashbacks to when they were driving to Camp Devon, and Mike explained how he found out about the place. David then had a scary thought that the forest stalkers put that poster up as a way of manipulating them into going to wherever they wanted to lure them. He then also thought about the sign near the entrance and how that was a setup as well. However, as John was talking to David, David noticed a man yelling in the parking lot. The man was calling for help, claiming that he was hurt badly. David then had a plan to help this guy, since it seemed like the right thing to do in this situation. John asked David if he was still there, and David abruptly said he had to go and hung up before John could finish his sentence. David got outside of his car and ran over to the man who was hurt. As David got closer, however, he noticed the man's arm was bloody, indicating that his arm was injured somehow. The man begged for David to help him, and David assured the man that he'd call an ambulance and get him to safety. However, as David was standing near the man, what happened next was something shocking that David would never expect to happen. The man then pulled out a gun and put David in a chokehold with the gun to his head, quicker than David could react. David tried to scream, but the man covered his mouth so nobody could hear him. The man suddenly sounded normal and serious when he spoke, saying that he was faking his injury just to get David to come over so he could take advantage. The man said that he used this as an opportunity to kill David and the rest of his friends back at camp. David was shocked to hear the man say this because it didn't make sense how the man knew he was camping with his friends. He then had this fear that the man who was threatening him was one of the 4 stalkers since he knew their whereabouts. The man yelled at David to get in the car as he grabbed him aggressively and put him in the front seat with the gun aimed at his head. The man intimidatingly told David not to move or he'd kill him. David was shaking in fear and didn't know what to do since he was so vulnerable in this situation. The man went to the passenger seat, still pointing the gun at David. The man told David to start driving back to camp, so he began driving with the man in the car, knowing that he had no choice but to listen to him or else he would die. Meanwhile, Mike and Jill were still waiting in the camper, thinking about the unsettling voice they heard on the walkie-talkie from earlier. Mike concluded that the person or thing on the walkie-talkie killed the group members that went on the hike. Jill blamed a lot of this on the cop who refused to help them when they needed it the most, and who knows what could have been prevented if that happened. Meanwhile, David was driving down the dark country road to the camp while being held hostage by the stranger who attacked him. He questioned the man about being one of them. He used the word them, which referred to one of the 4 stalkers. The man was confused by what David meant and stated that all he knew was that he had to kill David and the rest of the group. David was very confused as to what the man said. If the man wasn't a 4 stalker, then why was he so desperate to hurt them? What would have happened if he didn't? The man then revealed his name to be Rob and asked what David's name was, but David refused to tell him. Rob played the victim, claiming David was being rude, but David called him out for the psycho he really was. Rob told David to shut up and keep driving, so he did. However, as David was driving, he suddenly slammed on the brakes and tried to attack Rob until Rob hit him in the face with his gun. He groaned in pain, but then Rob pulled out a large knife and stabbed him in the leg with it. David was screaming in pain as he did this, then Rob pulled it out abruptly. Rob warned David not to do that again, so he started driving, but this time he had a bruise on his face and a wounded leg. Meanwhile, Mike and Jill were still waiting in the camper. Jill was checking outside to see when David would come back, but he hadn't yet. Jill assumed that David's car broke down since it was over an hour after he left, but Mike didn't think that was what happened. Mike told Jill that they had no choice but to stay inside the camper since it was the safest place to be in this situation, so Jill nodded her head in agreement. Mike and Jill waited for a few more minutes until they noticed car lights moving towards them from up the dirt road entrance to the campsite. They ran near the camper window and they saw David's car pull up. Jill quickly helped Mike with something before they were about to go outside and see David, not knowing what was really going on. Mike and Jill were about to go outside until they saw Rob walk out of the car and grab David, who had a bruised face and a leg that was bleeding. Jill gasped in shock and was about to scream until Mike covered her mouth and held her in place to try and calm her down. Rob pushed David to his knees and made him face the camper. Rob then held the gun to David's head while facing the camper, with the car headlights shining brightly in the camp. Rob was shouting towards the camper, saying that he knew Mike and Jill were in there and to come out or else he'd kill David. Mike and Jill thought for a second that Rob was one of the 4 stalkers, but this wasn't the kind of thing they do, killing someone in the open with their face revealed, because Nick said they usually attack one in the shadows. So what was really happening here? This was a new and scary experience for the group, because they had this mysterious guy who apparently wasn't a 4 stalker, but he wanted to kill them. Nothing made sense, and things were only getting worse as time moved on. What Rob did next was shocking, and something that would make the group more vulnerable. He pulled out a knife, the same knife he used earlier, and started slashing the tires on Mike's car one by one until they were all popped. Mike then had a plan, telling Jill that she needed to go outside with her hands up and pretend to turn herself into Rob. Jill thought that Mike was crazy and didn't want to do this, but he convinced her that if she could trick Rob into thinking that it was only her, this would give Mike time to load his shotgun, surprise attack Rob, and kill him. Jill nodded her head after Mike explained this to her, so she took a deep breath, summing up the courage to walk outside. Meanwhile, Mike was about to load the shotgun with slugs and gather the ammunition. Rob warned them one last time that if they don't come out, that he killed David, but Jill then opened the door and went outside with her hands up. She slowly walked over to Rob, dreading each time she stepped closer to him. David told Jill not to listen to Rob, no matter what he told her. Then Rob told him to shut up and hit him in the face with his gun. Rob asked where the rest of the group was, and Jill said that it was only her. He didn't believe this and said he certainly knew that there were more of them. Jill was confused as to how Rob knew there were more of them, and this made her afraid. Meanwhile, Mike was having problems loading the shotgun because it was jammed. He got annoyed as he was trying to unjam the barrel as quickly as he could. Meanwhile, Rob asked Jill where the others were, and Jill said yet again that it was just her. Suddenly, Rob put his knife to David's face because he knew that she was lying. David was shaking in fear, knowing that things were going to get real bad. Jill begged for Rob not to hurt him, but Rob kept mentioning that he needed to kill them all and said he'd cut David's eyes out one at a time if Jill didn't tell him where the rest of the group was. She tried to persuade Rob that there was nobody else but her. That's when Rob began slowly cutting David's left eye. David screamed in pain as he did this, and Jill was freaking out, horrified by what was happening. Meanwhile, Mike was getting angry due to a combination of hearing the commotion from outside the camper and still trying to unjam his shotgun. Meanwhile, Jill was crying while yelling at Rob in anger and sadness, questioning why he was doing this to them. Rob began cutting David's eye more as he continued to scream. Meanwhile, Mike finally unjammed the shotgun and loaded the slugs as fast as he could. David kept screaming, and his eye fell onto the ground, and blood poured out from the socket. Jill screamed in shock and terror as she saw David's eyeball on the ground, something that would scar her for life. David was groaning in pain, almost about to pass out. Rob began to cut David's other eye out until Mike kicked the door open to the camper and ran out with his shotgun. Mike screamed like a madman, ordering Rob to drop his weapon. Rob was shocked to see Mike come out with a weapon and didn't know what to do. He was angry that Jill lied to him, and Mike kept demanding Rob to drop his weapon, but he refused to listen. Suddenly, Rob shot David's other leg, causing him to scream again this time. Mike tried to shoot Rob, but Rob dodged his shot by going behind his car and shot at Mike, almost hitting him. David screamed in more pain as he lied on the ground with a missing eye, a stab wound on one leg, and a gunshot wound on the other leg. Mike shot Rob, but the round only skimmed him at the edge of the car and didn't do much damage. He followed Rob around the car and kept shooting at him until eventually hitting his leg, and he fell to the ground. Mike tried to shoot Rob in the head, but he was out of ammunition since he didn't have a lot of shotgun slugs. Rob stood up and began firing his last rounds towards Mike, but he dodged them by taking cover behind the other side of the car. Rob also ran out of ammo, so he picked up his knife and tried to stab David, who was on the ground still, but Mike quickly ran over and tackled him to the ground. He kept punching Rob in the face while yelling like a madman, since he had so much adrenaline rushing through him. Jill went over to David, who was lying on the ground, and helped him up. She yelled towards Mike, saying that they needed to leave, but Mike told her and David to go without him, since he had to finish Rob off. Jill nodded her head, so she grabbed David, and they went off into the woods together. Mike and Rob kept fighting brutally, each of them having equivalent fighting styles, making it last long. Mike then remembered that he had a spare shotgun slug in his pocket, but he didn't realize it until now. He then kicked Rob in the face, knocking him to the ground, and crawled over to his shotgun. Mike quickly loaded his shotgun as Rob ran over with the knife and tried to stab Mike in the heart until he shot Rob in the head, and blood splattered all over him, along with the remnants of Rob's brains. Mike screamed in disgust as blood and flesh got on his face and clothes. It was an insane feeling for Mike, killing someone for the first time, but he didn't regret it, since Rob deserved to die for what he did. He went over to Rob's dead body and noticed a small piece of paper sticking out of his pocket. Out of curiosity, Mike picked it up and saw that it was a note which said, "Kill them or you will die," written with blood. Mike was unsettled by this and didn't know what it meant. Just when Mike thought things couldn't get worse, there was a picture sticking out of Rob's pocket, and Mike picked it up. What he saw next would for sure scar him for life. It was a picture of him and the others sitting together near the camper at the campsite during the day. The photo was taken from the woods, and Mike examined each of their faces. It all came together now, the note and the photo. Mike now knew why Rob tried to kill them. It wasn't for no reason. He was threatened by the forest stalkers, and they used Rob as a puppet to make him do their dirty work as a form of manipulation and fear. Mike didn't know how to process this and couldn't understand how the forest stalkers were this intelligent at putting fear and pain into their lives. He then went into the camper to get more ammunition for the shotgun and ran off in the direction that Jill and David went in, still holding his shotgun while covered in blood. Meanwhile, Alex was still limping in the woods due to his leg injury and kept hearing unsettling noises from nearby. Suddenly, Alex heard a voice from the woods saying that there was nowhere to go, and he panicked, limping away as fast as he could. Alex then noticed someone lying on the ground, crying. He moved closer and saw that it was none other than Elizabeth, who looked like she'd been through insanity. Elizabeth looked up at Alex, and he saw that her face was covered in blood and dirt. He told her that they had to go back to camp, so he got closer to help her. Alex was about to help Elizabeth until he heard leaves cracking from nearby, then looked around to see if it was being watched. Elizabeth screamed Alex's name because she saw a dark figure standing behind him. The figure then went up to Alex with a rope and started choking him with it. He tried to fight back but failed, and the person choked him to death. Elizabeth then got hit in the head by the person, causing enough damage that would make her bleed out and die. Meanwhile, David and Jill were walking in the woods together, Jill helping David walk since he had a limp from the major wounds in his leg. David said that he couldn't die like this, and Jill assured David that he wasn't going to die, mentioning that Mike was going to help them get out once they met up with him. He questioned this, reminding Jill that they'd been stalked and attacked by a bunch of psychopaths in the woods with higher IQs than they did. Jill understood David's concern, but still tried to convince him not to give up. They continued walking through the woods, checking their surroundings while doing so. Meanwhile, Mike was walking in the woods with his flashlight and his shotgun, scanning the area for people or things that would attack him. He called out for David and Jill, but nobody answered, since they were already a quarter mile away at this point. Mike then started shouting in the woods, asking the forest stalkers why they won't just come out and kill them if they're so determined to. He then fired a round to appear intimidating and showed a level of confidence. David and Jill heard the gunshot and looked in the direction it was coming from. They assumed it was Mike, since he was the only person in the group with a gun. They started heading in the direction it came from, hoping to find Mike. Meanwhile, Mike kept walking through the woods, but then started to hear strange noises from nearby, like clicking sounds, whispers, and voices. The voices were saying stuff like, "You should have never come here," and "We are your death." He pointed his gun and tried to find where the sounds and voices were coming from, but it didn't sound like it was coming from a specific direction. It seemed to be coming from everywhere. Mike then noticed something very unsettling. There was a message on a tree written in blood which said, "We're always watching you." Mike was terrified now and started to run in fear of being attacked, checking his surroundings as he did so. Meanwhile, David and Jill tried to find Mike from where they heard the gunshot, but couldn't. They both called his name, but got no answer. Meanwhile, Mike was also calling for David and Jill while running, but the problem is, none of them could hear each other due to the distance of how far they were from each other. Mike kept hearing footsteps around him and was checking his surroundings, paranoid of what was watching him. Suddenly, however, he noticed the silhouette of a person running past a tree ahead of him. Mike started firing his shotgun in hopes of hitting whoever was running. He kept shooting out of fear, and eventually he stopped to listen for more sounds. Mike was walking slowly, getting more nervous with each step he took. As he was walking, however, he heard leaves crunch from behind him. Mike turned around, but his neck got snapped by something monstrous with immense strength. He fell to the ground, and whatever it was killed him, meaning that Mike, the leader of the group, was now dead. Meanwhile, Jill and David were trying to find a way out of the woods onto the main road. They knew that they were lost, and they began to lose hope. Jill assumed that Mike was dead since they heard no more gunshots and wondered how they'd make it without Mike and knew that the others were dead along with Mike. David's legs were hurting badly, so Jill helped him sit down near a tree and put him in a comfortable position. They then heard a sound from nearby, and it was an indescribable yet unsettling sound that could only mean it was the forest stalkers approaching them. David handed Jill his knife and she held it, getting ready to fight if she could. He told Jill that she should leave him behind, but she refused to let him die. David was starting to accept his fate because he was bleeding from both legs. One of them was a stab wound and the other was a gunshot wound. Not to mention he lost an eye, which also contributed to more blood loss, and there was no hospital since they were in the middle of nowhere. Jill was tearing up, realizing that David was right. David and Jill said their goodbyes, so Jill left him and ran off. She was angry now and started to act intimidating, shouting into the woods at the forest stalkers just like Mike did earlier. Meanwhile, David was sitting near the log, but he started to hallucinate from paranoia. He thought he saw a bunch of dark figures from a distance in front of him and heard unsettling sounds. He started breathing heavily as his anxiety levels went up. Suddenly, however, someone then grabbed David from behind and pulled him over the log aggressively. Whoever grabbed David slit his throat and killed him. Meanwhile, Jill kept walking in the forest, not knowing what to expect. As she was walking, however, she came across a hiking backpack and realized that it was Elizabeth's. She ran over to search the inside of the bag and found a camera. Jill then had this idea of recording what was happening to show footage to whoever may see it if they found the camera, as a way of proving the evidence of the forest stalkers if she didn't make it. Before Jill could start recording, however, she heard a faint and unsettling laugh from the distance. This horrified her, so she ran as far away as possible with the camera in her hand while panicking and crying. She stopped to catch her breath and turned the camera on. Jill was crying while she recorded because of how overwhelming the situation was for her. She knew that her husband was dead because it was obvious that the forest stalkers were too intelligent and dangerous for them to beat, and without a doubt knew she was the last person in the group alive. Jill then said this on the recording.
If someone is watching this, I just want you to know that you need to stay out of the woods. There are these people and things that have been hunting me and my friends. They were watching us for a while, and we didn't know it. They're called the forest stalkers. I think they killed my husband, and they for sure killed my friends. I'm so afraid. I can't do this anymore.
Suddenly, Jill heard a sound from nearby and looked to see what it was. Jill then screamed in fear and something pulled her away from the camera and it fell to the ground. The view of the camera was just the dark forest and the eerie sounds of it now. However, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps came near the camera and something picked it up. What footage the camera captured next was something that would haunt the dreams of anybody who saw it. There, the face of the creature that Nick described was on the camera video. Red eyes with black human-like pupils, a bald head, deformed facial features, and a wide, fixated smile. The forest stalkers killed Mike, Alan, Alex, Elizabeth, David, and Jill, meaning that they still proved to their victims that nobody could beat them, and it would take a lot more to do so, since their psychotic agenda was something unlike no other. Since Camp Devon was in the middle of nowhere, far in the woods, no survivors witnessed the horrifying events like the main group did, meaning that the forest stalkers were still a mystery to other people, and they were still out there, continuing to do what they do.